It was an ordinary morning when everything changed, though no one could have guessed it at the time. The sun rose slowly over a small town, where life moved at a quiet, predictable pace. The main character, a person who had lived a simple life, was going through the usual routine. Breakfast was modest, the coffee bitter but comforting, and the day ahead seemed no different from any other. They had no grand plans, no expectations of wealth or sudden fortune. Life had been steady, sometimes challenging, but nothing extraordinary had ever happened, at least, not in ways that made the world stop or people stare. The letter arrived unexpectedly. It was heavy, the kind of weight that made one pause even before reading the content. There was no flashy envelope, no gilded edges or official seals that screamed importance. Just a simple envelope with neat handwriting, slightly smudged at the corners. It had been delivered by the local postman, who barely looked up when handing it over. At first, it seemed like just another piece of junk mail, a bill, or some notice from the town authorities. But something about the envelope felt different. Something felt serious. Opening it was slow, careful, almost hesitant. The main character unfolded the paper and stared at the words, not quite believing what was written. They had inherited something enormous. 1,300 acres of land. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Acres, open fields, forests, maybe even buildings and streams, all suddenly belonging to someone who had lived quietly, never imagining such wealth. There were legal documents, maps, and papers detailing the property. The letter was clear. It was theirs, completely and irrevocably. At first, there was disbelief. How could this happen? Who had left this behind, and why? There was no warning, no gradual introduction to the idea of inheriting something so vast. The main character read and reread the documents, eyes scanning every line, every paragraph, making sure they were not misreading. They were. It was real. The land was theirs. Excitement mixed with fear. This was a life-changing moment, one that people only heard about in stories or movies. But for them, it was not a story. It was real. There was so much to think about. Who would want to buy the land? Could it be developed? Should it be kept as it was? So many questions crowded the mind, and yet there was a quiet thrill running beneath all the anxiety. Life had just changed completely, and no one else could truly understand the depth of that change yet. Word spreads faster than anyone expects. Within hours of the news getting out, neighbors began to notice small hints. Friends and acquaintances called with curiosity, some with congratulations, others with thinly veiled interest in what this land could mean. Even casual conversations at the local store carried a different tone. People were whispering about the new landowner, trying to piece together who this quiet, unassuming person really was, and how they had suddenly become the owner of something so massive. Among the first reactions were smirks and scoffs. A few locals had assumed that this person would never be able to handle such responsibility. They expected the main character to panic, make mistakes, and perhaps sell off the property in pieces. Some laughed behind closed doors, thinking this would be a temporary situation, a passing curiosity before the land slipped from inexperienced hands into those more powerful or connected. It was as if no one could imagine that someone so ordinary could suddenly become a person of influence. Someone who could shape the future of a large and important property. Yet, even in the face of doubt, there was a quiet resolve. The main character did not panic. They did not rush to sell or hand over the land to anyone else. Instead, there was a need to understand what they had inherited. The first step was to walk the land, to see it with their own eyes. They wanted to touch the soil, feel the weight of the trees, and listen to the quiet hum of life that had existed there long before they had even been born. Each acre told a story, and for the first time, they were standing at the center of it as they walked through the fields, the forests, and along the streams that ran through the property. They began to notice details that others might have overlooked. The land was more than just property. It was a living, breathing entity. The streams were clear, the soil rich, the trees tall and ancient in places. There were small hills where the wind blew freely, open spaces perfect for farming or development, and areas of untouched beauty that seemed sacred in their silence. Every step revealed possibilities and responsibilities in the evenings. The house was quiet except for the rustling of papers and the ticking of a clock. The main character pored over maps, old deeds, and property records. They learned about boundaries that had been contested, streams that defined lines, and history that had been buried under decades of neglect. Some sections of the land were untouched for generations, while others had been farmed or developed slightly. It was a puzzle, a complex web of ownership, nature, and legacy, and the main character was determined to understand every piece of it. There were letters from lawyers, some formal, some cautious, offering advice and outlining options. There were calls from distant relatives, some claiming rights, others only curious. Each interaction carried a subtle pressure, a sense that everyone expected the new owner to falter. But the main character took their time, asking questions, taking notes, and thinking carefully about every step. Knowledge became their first tool of power. As days passed, the initial shock began to settle into a quiet, steady determination. The main character realized that the land could be a gift or a challenge, depending on how they approached it. They could sell it quickly and make a fortune, or they could take time to understand its true potential, its hidden treasures, and the legacy it represented. Already, the seeds of strategy were forming. They were learning to see the land not just as property, but as influence, identity, in a way to shape their own future in ways they had never imagined. Evenings often found the main character sitting by a small fire, or at a modest desk, writing down thoughts and plans. They imagined walking through the land in seasons to come, planning improvements, and considering ways to protect what was theirs. Every decision was deliberate. There was a patience growing, an awareness that this inheritance was a turning point, a chance to reshape life in ways that few people ever get. Neighbors and townspeople began to take notice. Some tried to approach casually, offering advice or seeking favors. Others were distant, watching from afar, uncertain how this person would act. The main character learned to navigate these interactions carefully, smiling politely while keeping their intentions clear only to themselves. It was a delicate balance between curiosity and caution, between excitement and realism. The first night spent walking the land alone was unforgettable. The sky stretched endlessly, stars shining brighter than ever before, and the wind whispered through the trees as if acknowledging a new guardian. It was a moment of reflection and anticipation. For the first time, the main character felt the weight of responsibility, but also the thrill of possibility. They were no longer just living an ordinary life. They were stepping into a story that was larger than themselves, one that would challenge them, teach them, and eventually define them. And so, what began as an ordinary morning became a turning point in a life that had once seemed small and predictable. The inheritance of 1,300 acres was not just a gift. It was an awakening. It would bring challenges, encounters, and lessons that no one could foresee. But on that first day, as the main character looked out over the vast silent land, a quiet determination took root. They were ready, even if no one else expected it. They had inherited much more than land. They had inherited the chance to take control of their own destiny. From that day forward, life would never be the same. Simple routines were replaced with decisions that mattered. Small interactions carried weight, and every step on the land became a step toward understanding, mastering, and eventually owning not just property, but a legacy. This was the beginning of something bigger than anyone had imagined. The first chapter in a story that would transform an ordinary life into one marked by resilience, intelligence, and quiet power. Word traveled faster than expected. By the time the main character had fully begun to comprehend what the inheritance truly meant, people in town had already started talking. At first it was subtle. A neighbor would casually ask how the new property owner was settling in, while glancing around as if trying to measure the reaction. Shopkeepers whispered, and the small group of friends who had always known the main character now looked at them differently. Some smiles seemed warmer than before, while others felt cautious, almost calculating. It was not long before strangers arrived. A few people claiming to represent development companies showed up, offering deals and promises that sounded too good to be true. They spoke of turning the land into resorts, subdivisions, or commercial centers. Their words were smooth, their smiles practiced. They assumed the main character would be naive, ready to sign papers and hand over the property without fully understanding its worth. But they had no idea how careful and observant the new owner was. Calls and emails multiplied. Every day brought new messages, some friendly, some aggressive. Distant relatives who had never been particularly close suddenly remembered old family connections. They inquired politely at first, but soon the tone shifted, hinting at hidden claims, past debts, and old arrangements that might give them a say in the property. It was exhausting, confusing, and sometimes intimidating. The main character had to learn quickly that people often act out of greed when faced with wealth, that not everyone who smiles has honest intentions. Neighbors were another challenge. Some were openly skeptical. A few whispered that the land would be sold within weeks, that the main character had no idea what they were dealing with, that the inheritance would slip from inexperienced hands. Others were curious about what could be done with so much space. They offered advice without being asked, some giving suggestions about farming, others talking about hunting grounds, or even turning parts of the land into rental property. The main character listened politely, but remained careful. Taking notes and weighing each conversation, there were moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. The main character would sit late into the night, reviewing documents and legal papers, trying to make sense of zoning laws, land permits, and property taxes. Every call seemed to add another layer of complexity. Some people expected decisions immediately, but rushing was dangerous. A single mistake could cost not just money, but control. It was clear that knowledge and patience were the most valuable tools. Despite the pressure, the main character began to notice patterns. Those who came with offers often underestimated their resolve. They assumed fear or inexperience would lead to a quick agreement. But the new owner had an advantage they could not see: determination. The main character was not looking to sell immediately. Instead, they were learning, observing, and preparing. Each interaction was carefully noted. Names, intentions, and subtle hints were recorded. This was not just about land, it was about understanding people. It's the ones who would try to manipulate the situation for their own gain. The land itself became a teacher. Every visit revealed something new. The streams had boundaries that were not clear on the maps. Some fields had soil rich enough for crops, while others needed repair or clearing. Forested areas were dense and wild, requiring planning to use responsibly. There were old structures, abandoned barns and cabins, each with a story. Each a clue to what life had once been like on this property. The main character walked the land repeatedly, feeling the weight and responsibility of every acre. It was as if the land was whispering its secrets, guiding the careful steps of its new owner. Encounters with locals were not always pleasant. One afternoon, a man from town approached with a confident smile, speaking about a better plan for the land. He claimed knowledge of old agreements that supposedly allowed him a voice in what could happen. His tone was casual, but threatening underneath. The main character listened, asked questions, and remained calm, refusing to be intimidated. Every word was a test, and the visitor left frustrated, realizing that this inheritance was not a gift to be exploited by anyone other than the rightful owner. Some of the distant relatives tried subtler methods. They sent letters expressing concern for the land, hinting at shared family responsibilities. They spoke of legacy, history, and tradition, attempting to guilt or persuade the main character into agreements that were not fair. But the new owner had learned the importance of careful reading. Every word, every hint, and every suggestion was cross-checked. Documents were reviewed with lawyers and experts, ensuring that no claim could stand against the rightful ownership. The relatives' smiles hid impatience, but they could see that this was not someone who would bend easily. Amid the pressure, there were small moments of clarity and joy. Walking through fields untouched for decades, seeing deer leap through the woods, feeling the cool breeze over a small hill, it became clear that this land was more than money or power. It was life, history, and opportunity. Each corner held potential, whether for farming, conservation, or simple enjoyment. The main character began to imagine not just ownership, but stewardship. The land demanded care, attention, and respect, and in return, it offered a sense of purpose. Planning became crucial. Maps were studied carefully, boundaries double-checked, and plans drawn. The main character started to understand the full scope of the land. There were areas rich in resources, forests teeming with wildlife, and streams that could be maintained for both beauty and practicality. Every decision required thought. Rushing would only create mistakes. Patience became a powerful ally, and observation became a strategy at the same time. The social aspect of ownership could not be ignored. Conversations at the local store, casual meetings with neighbors, and interactions with distant relatives all carried weight. The main character learned to listen more than they spoke, to smile politely while gathering information, and to be deliberate in every word. Every interaction could reveal intentions, weaknesses, or opportunities. Slowly, respect began to grow. People who had assumed this person would be overwhelmed began to see strength, patience, and intelligence. The perception that this inheritance was a temporary gift for someone inexperienced began to shift. Late nights were spent researching history. Old records, town archives, and past ownership documents were explored to understand the land's story. There were hints of past disputes, forgotten agreements, and historical significance. Learning these details was not just about knowledge, it was about building confidence, understanding leverage, and preparing for challenges that would inevitably come. The main character realized that knowing the land meant knowing people, because every dispute, claim, or attempt to influence ownership was rooted in history. Gradually, the main character began to feel more in control. The early fear and uncertainty gave way to a quiet confidence. Each conversation, each walk through the fields, each review of documents strengthened resolve. The pressure from relatives, strangers, and locals remained, but it was met with preparation, patience, and strategic thinking. The main character was no longer a passive owner. They were learning to be a capable one, someone who could not be easily influenced or intimidated. Even ordinary moments became lessons. Observing the growth of trees, the patterns of wildlife, and the flow of water through the streams revealed insights into how the land could be managed. Decisions that once seemed overwhelming were approached methodically. Each small victory clarifying boundaries, understanding property taxes, or simply walking through difficult terrain added to confidence. The main character was becoming someone who could take charge without arrogance, who could balance caution with action. There were setbacks, too. Misunderstandings with distant relatives, incorrect assumptions by advisors, unexpected challenges in understanding property regulations created stress. But each challenge became a learning opportunity. The main character learned to stay calm, gather facts, and respond deliberately. The people who had hoped to see hesitation now began to sense that this owner was different, someone who would not falter under pressure, as weeks turned into months. The story of the inheritance became well known in town. People no longer whispered, just out of curiosity; they spoke with a mix of respect and wariness. Developers who had hoped for a quick deal realized that this was not going to be easy. Relatives who had hoped for influence understood that patience and intelligence were stronger than pressure or persuasion. The main character had quietly shifted the balance of perception. Even in solitude, the main character continued to plan. Night after night, they mapped strategies, considered possibilities, and envisioned the future. They did not yet know exactly what the next steps would be, but the foundation was laid. Knowledge, patience, and observation had become the tools of control. The inheritance was not a fleeting opportunity. It was a responsibility that demanded respect, understanding, and courage. By the end of this period, the main character had transformed internally. From someone initially overwhelmed by sudden fortune, had become someone observant, patient, and increasingly confident. The land had not only changed their life materially, but had reshaped their mindset. The initial fear of outsiders, pressure, and challenges had been replaced with careful resolve. The land was theirs, but so was the responsibility to protect it, understand it, and eventually use it wisely. The first months of ownership were not easy, but they were critical. They taught lessons that no book, conversation, or advice could provide. The main character had learned to navigate pressure, assess intentions, and trust their judgment. The inheritance of 1,300 acres had become a living teacher, and the person who had inherited it was slowly becoming someone capable of managing not just land, but the expectations, challenges, and strategies that came with it. By this point, the main character had learned a vital truth: the people around them would judge, test, and attempt to influence them, but patience, careful observation, and deliberate action were stronger than fear, doubt, or pressure. The inheritance was not merely a gift of land, it was a test of character. And with each passing day, the main character grew stronger, more confident, and better prepared for the challenges that were only beginning to unfold by the time the main character had settled into the rhythm of managing the inheritance. It became clear that understanding the land was only part of the challenge. The other part was understanding the people who surrounded it. Every visit to town, every phone call, every meeting carried layers of subtle pressure and hidden intentions. Some were friendly, some cautious, and some clearly aimed at testing their confidence and patience. The main character realized quickly that to truly take control, it wasn't enough to know the land. They had to know the game and the players. The first step was observation. The main character began paying closer attention to details that had once seemed minor. When neighbors offered advice, it wasn't just about what they said, but how they said it. Subtle glances, pauses, the tone of voice, all provided hints about intentions. A person who spoke with exaggerated friendliness might actually be looking for an opportunity to influence decisions. Someone who was quiet and distant could be weighing the main character's reaction. Every interaction became a lesson in human behavior, teaching patience and discernment. Simultaneously, the land itself continued to reveal its secrets. Walking through the property became an almost daily routine. Each visit revealed new challenges and opportunities. A hill that had seemed simple at first might show signs of erosion. A stream that looked shallow could hide deep spots. Forested areas often contained unexpected obstacles or treasures. The main character learned to slow down, to take in every detail. This was not just about managing property, it was about truly connecting with it. They began to feel a sense of responsibility that went beyond ownership. It was stewardship. Learning became the central focus. The main character started consulting expert surveyors, environmentalists, and agricultural advisors to understand what the land could support. Questions were asked relentlessly. Which areas were best for crops? Where could water be conserved? Which forests needed protection? Slowly, a plan began to take shape, though it was still in its early stages. Every consultation was an opportunity to learn not just about the land, but about how others viewed it, how best to navigate their advice without losing control. The pressure from outsiders did not fade. Developers were still calling, some offering large sums of money to buy sections of the property. Distant relatives tried to insert themselves into decisions, sometimes presenting subtle threats veiled in concern. Local authorities occasionally reminded the main character about permits, regulations, and taxes, often in ways that seemed unnecessarily complicated. The main character understood that these pressures were not personal. They were part of the landscape of sudden power and wealth. They also realized that patience, preparation, and careful planning would be their strongest allies. Mistakes were inevitable, though, and each one was a lesson. Early on, the main character had underestimated the complexity of old property agreements. Certain boundaries were not clearly documented, leading to confusion with neighbors and legal advisors. At first, frustration bubbled, but soon it was replaced with curiosity and determination. Every mistake became an opportunity to learn, to double-check details, and to anticipate future challenges. By facing these issues head-on, the main character began to develop a reputation not as someone easily intimidated, but as someone thorough and capable. Trust became a tricky matter. A few locals tried to offer guidance, claiming knowledge of previous owners or the history of the property. Some were genuine, but others had hidden motives. The main character learned to verify every claim and consult multiple sources before making decisions. Trust could not be given lightly, because with 1,300 acres at stake, even small misjudgments could be costly. This careful approach gradually filtered out those who were not trustworthy and strengthened connections with those who were. The main character also began building small alliances, not out of necessity, but strategy. People who had lived on or near the land for decades often knew things that were not recorded in documents: hidden water sources, soil quality in different fields, or areas prone to flooding. By listening, learning, and acknowledging their knowledge, the main character gained allies who became invaluable guides. These connections were subtle, based on mutual respect and a shared understanding that the land was more than money. It was life, history, and opportunity, even as strategies formed. The main character did not lose sight of the everyday reality of the land. Physical work became a part of life. Walking through forests, clearing paths, inspecting structures, and even repairing old fences gave a tangible sense of progress. Each task reinforced a bond with the land and a confidence that was not purely theoretical. It was one thing to read maps and plans. It was another to feel the soil underfoot, hear the wind through the trees, and see the patterns of wildlife firsthand. These experiences became a foundation for decision-making. Turning abstract knowledge into practical insight, social dynamics in town continued to shift. People who had once underestimated the main character began to take notice. The casual whispers and smirks were replaced with curiosity and, in some cases, respect. It was clear to outsiders that this person was not naive or easily swayed. Offers that had seemed overwhelming or persuasive before were now evaluated carefully. Each decision weighed against knowledge, instinct, and the bigger picture. By refusing to be rushed, the main character slowly began to set the terms of engagement. The main character also discovered the emotional side of ownership. Walking the land, witnessing the beauty of untouched fields, the quiet majesty of forests, and the patterns of wildlife brought a profound sense of connection. The inheritance was not just a material gain. It was a responsibility that carried weight and meaning. Decisions were no longer purely about money or control. They were about legacy, about preserving the essence of the land while making it productive and sustainable. This emotional bond strengthened resolve and created a sense of purpose that went beyond everyday challenges. Challenges continued to arise unexpectedly. A storm damaged part of the property, highlighting areas that needed reinforcement and planning for future contingencies. Disputes with neighbors over boundaries resurfaced, requiring patience, diplomacy, and a careful understanding of historical records. Each problem was an opportunity to test judgment, assert authority, and strengthen control. The main character discovered that leadership was not about aggression or confrontation, but about persistence, observation, and strategic action. Patience became a defining quality. The main character realized that people around them were testing limits, gauging reactions, and expecting mistakes. By staying calm, deliberate, and thoughtful, they turned potential pressure into advantage. Each interaction, each challenge, and each decision reinforced confidence. It was a process of transformation from someone suddenly thrust into ownership to someone capable of managing complexity, anticipating problems, and asserting control when necessary. The main character's understanding of timing also grew sharper. Some decisions required immediate action, while others needed waiting, observation, or further research. Acting too quickly could create mistakes, while hesitating too long might allow others to gain influence. This balance was delicate but crucial. Over time, they became adept at knowing when to act and when to observe, turning patience into a tool as valuable as knowledge itself. In addition to managing external pressures, the main character worked on internal growth. They learned to trust instincts, to balance caution with initiative, and to value careful analysis over rushed judgment. The inheritance had become a teacher, showing that wealth and responsibility were inseparable from insight, character, and foresight. They were no longer simply reacting to events. They were shaping outcomes, learning to anticipate moves, and guiding the future of the property with quiet authority. By now, Subtle transformation was visible to those who knew the main character. The initial uncertainty and hesitation had been replaced with composure and confidence. Even skeptics in town began to acknowledge that this person was not only capable, but also determined. They had learned to navigate pressure, assess intentions, and make decisions with clarity. The land had become a mirror, reflecting the growth of its new owner. Every day offered new lessons. Observing the wildlife, understanding seasonal changes, and noticing subtle differences in soil quality created insights that informed future decisions. Practical tasks, such as maintaining fences, inspecting water sources, and walking the property reinforced knowledge gained from books, maps, and advisors. The main character began to see the land as a complex ecosystem where each decision had ripple effects. This perspective allowed for thoughtful planning and foresight that few others could match. Evenings were often spent reviewing notes, planning strategies, or simply reflecting on progress. The main character had begun to see the inheritance not just as land, but as a story of legacy, responsibility, and potential. Each challenge, interaction, and observation was a chapter in that story, shaping them into someone capable of. Understanding the true scope of ownership, the main character also realized that control was not about force or dominance, but about understanding, preparation, and respect. The people around them, whether curious, greedy, or skeptical, would only respond to consistent, calm authority. By asserting presence through knowledge and careful decision-making, the main character gradually established credibility. What once seemed like pressure became opportunities to demonstrate competence by the end of this period. The main character had developed a strong foundation. Knowledge of the land, understanding of human behavior, and strategic patience had created a sense of quiet control. The challenges had not disappeared. But the main character had transformed from a hesitant inheritor into someone ready to take decisive steps. When the time was right, confidence was no longer tentative, it was deliberate, grounded in experience. The inheritance of 1,300 acres had begun to shape more than just daily life. It had transformed character, perspective, and capacity. The main character understood now that true power came from preparation, insight, and careful action. The land, with all its complexity and history, had become both a challenge and a guide. And with each passing day, the main character moved closer to mastering not only the property, but the expectations, pressures, and strategies that accompanied it. In these months, the quiet patience, careful observation, and deliberate planning had created the foundation for the next stage of ownership. The main character had learned that strength was built over time, the pressure could be managed, and that respect was earned, not demanded. With this understanding, they were ready for the next phase, turning potential into action and ensuring that the inheritance was not just owned but guided with wisdom, insight, and unwavering determination. By the time the main character had spent months learning the land and understanding the people around it, it became clear that knowledge and patience had done more than prepare them. They had built power. The early days of uncertainty were long behind them. They were no longer simply reacting to offers, pressure, or curiosity. Now they could start to act with purpose. This was the moment when ownership moved from being a concept to being a reality, and control was no longer a distant goal, but an active choice. The first step in taking control was clarity. The main character spent long days reviewing maps, property records, and all the notes they had collected. Boundaries were confirmed and reinforced. Legal documents were double-checked, discrepancies corrected, and clear proof of ownership established. Any previous attempts to question the inheritance were quietly but firmly addressed. Relatives who had hinted at claims received polite but firm responses. Developers who had pressured for quick sales realized they would not be able to rush decisions. Every action communicated that this was no longer a casual or a certain situation. Walking through the land became an act of authority. The main character no longer explored simply to learn. They walked with purpose, observing how the property could be organized, maintained, and improved. Areas that had been neglected were identified and prioritized for restoration. Forested sections were marked for protection, while open fields were measured for potential use. Every step on the land communicated confidence and presence, not just to themselves, but to those who might try to influence or intimidate. There were small confrontations along the way. Tests from people who assumed the main character might hesitate. One afternoon, a developer returned, offering an amount of money that seemed impressive on the surface, but was far below the true value of the property. The developer tried to present it as a generous offer, hoping to catch the main character off guard. But the main character listened, asked questions, and responded with calm precision, outlining why the offer was unacceptable and explaining that no decision would be made without full consideration. The developer left, frustrated and surprised. Realizing that this new owner could not be pressured or rushed, other tests came in subtler forms. Relatives who had previously been quiet began sending letters expressing concern about the property. Hinting at shared responsibilities or legacy, they suggested minor improvements, certain sales, or partnerships that might benefit them. But the main character had learned to read between the lines. Every suggestion was analyzed for intent, historical context, and possible outcomes. Decisions were made deliberately, based on facts, priorities, and long-term vision. Slowly, the family members realized that influence could not be gained through persistence alone. Respect had to be earned. Part of asserting control was creating order. The main character began organizing the property systematically. Boundaries were clearly marked, access points secured, and areas designated for specific uses. Workers and caretakers were brought in, either from trusted locals or hired through careful vetting. Rules were established not to intimidate, but to ensure the property was respected and maintained properly. Even the smallest details mattered. Which paths were cleared first, how water sources were managed, and which sections required immediate attention. Each decision reinforced the message that the land was under capable and deliberate guidance. One of the most important lessons the main character had learned was that leadership required both visibility and discretion. They did not need to announce every move, but they ensured that key actions were noticed. Maintaining presence, whether through regular walks, overseeing projects, or speaking with caretakers, built confidence in their authority. At the same time, careful observation and behind-the-scenes planning ensured that no challenge came as a surprise. Knowledge became a tool for influence, and strategy became a guide for action. Encounters with neighbors became more structured. Casual conversations were no longer only social, they were opportunities to communicate leadership subtly. The main character listened, acknowledged input, and responded with thoughtful actions that demonstrated capability. People who had doubted them began to realize that this was not someone to be ignored or underestimated. Offers, suggestions, and casual advice were filtered through careful consideration. Over time, the town began to view the main character not just as a landowner, but as a leader in the community. A critical aspect of taking control was prioritization. With 1,300 acres, there was no way to manage everything at once. The main character began to assess which areas needed immediate attention, which could be preserved, and which could be developed. Small victories were celebrated quietly, repairing a long-neglected fence, restoring a stream bank, clearing an overgrown field. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced authority, built confidence, and established the rhythm of control. The main character also began planning for the long term. Discussions with experts, careful study of land use regulations, and strategic thinking created a vision for the property's future. It was not about quick profit or immediate recognition. It was about sustainable stewardship. Farms could be productive, forests protected, and streams maintained. Each decision was made with an eye toward balance, preserving natural beauty, respecting history, and creating practical opportunities. Control in this sense was not about dominance. It was about responsibility, foresight, and thoughtful execution. During this period, the main character faced resistance from those who still hoped for influence. Some tried intimidation, others attempted to confuse or overwhelm with information. But by now, the main character had learned the value of calm, deliberate action. Each encounter was approached with preparation, observation, and measured response. Mistakes were rare, and when they occurred, they were quickly corrected. Over time, the people who had tried to exert pressure realized that patience and strategic planning were stronger than force or persuasion. The transformation was not only external, but internal. The main character grew more confident in their judgment and decision-making. They learned to trust their instincts while backing them with research and planning. Challenges that had once seemed intimidating now became opportunities to demonstrate capability. Every interaction, every project, and every step on the land reinforced the sense of control. Ownership was no longer abstract. It was tangible, present, and respected. Practical projects began in earnest. Old barns were repaired and repurposed, fields were prepared for planting, and streams were cleared of debris. Caretakers were given responsibilities and guidance, ensuring that daily operations ran smoothly. Even small successes had large effects. A fence repaired correctly prevented trespassing. A cleared path made access easier, and restored structures signaled care and authority. These visible results communicated to everyone that the land was managed thoughtfully and with skill. In addition to physical improvements, the main character cultivated relationships carefully. Trusted neighbors, longtime workers, and knowledgeable locals became advisors. Their input was valued, but decisions remained firmly in the main character's hands. By balancing collaboration with authority, the new owner created a network of support while maintaining control. This approach ensured that actions were effective. That influence came from respect rather than fear or coercion. Some days brought moments of quiet reflection. Standing on a hill, overlooking fields, forests, and streams, the main character considered how far they had come. The land was no longer a vague inheritance. It was a living, breathing property under their guidance. The challenges had been many, but each one had strengthened their ability to act, lead, and plan. The responsibility was immense, but so was the satisfaction of seeing results from careful, deliberate action. The main character also began to anticipate future challenges. Property disputes, offers from developers, or unexpected events could occur at any time. By planning ahead, documenting decisions, and maintaining visibility, they minimized risks. They had learned the value of preparation, patience, and consistent action. Control was not about reacting to problems. It was about preventing them and responding with clarity and authority. When they did arise, respect grew steadily. People who had once doubted the main character now recognized competence. Offers and suggestions from outsiders were evaluated carefully, and most were politely declined or redirected. Distant relatives began to accept boundaries, realizing that influence could not be gained through pressure alone. Developers adjusted their strategies knowing that the main character would not be rushed. Through calm authority and deliberate action, control was no longer a possibility, it was an undeniable reality. The main character also understood that leadership required balance. Authority was not expressed through aggression or dominance. Instead, it was demonstrated through consistent decisions, careful planning, and visible presence. The land itself became a symbol of this authority, maintained, organized, and respected. Every path cleared, every boundary enforced, and every project completed was a statement of capability. Authority was felt, not announced. By now, small victories had built momentum. Fences repaired, fields cleared, and streams restored created visible proof of competence. Tasks that had once seemed daunting became manageable. Workers, advisors, and neighbors began to operate with confidence. Following guidance and recognizing the main character's capability, control was no longer an aspiration. It was a daily reality, built through strategy, patience, and careful execution. Evenings were spent reviewing progress, planning next steps, and reflecting on lessons learned. The main character had transformed from a hesitant inheritor into a decisive, capable owner. The land was no longer just a gift. It was a living responsibility. Every action reinforced authority, competence, and foresight. The inheritance was no longer a question. It was a foundation for future growth and opportunity. In the months that followed, the main character continued to assert control with quiet confidence. Challenges would continue to arise, but now they were met with preparation, insight, and calm authority. The land was productive, respected, and well managed. Outsiders who had doubted or pressured the main character were now aware that influence could not be forced, it could only be earned through patience, knowledge, and action. The transformation was clear from someone uncertain and overwhelmed. The main character had become a capable, confident owner. The inheritance of 1,300 acres had become more than property. It was a testament to perseverance, strategic thinking, and deliberate action. Control was no longer a goal to strive for. It was a reality that grew stronger with every decision, every project, and every careful interaction. By the end of this period, the main character had achieved a balance between authority and stewardship. The land was secure, organized, and productive. People around them had begun to respect not only the property, but also the person guiding it. Knowledge, patience, and strategy had transformed hesitation into control. And what had once seemed like a daunting inheritance had become a platform for leadership, opportunity, and lasting influence.